Easy English audiobook.
The Great Gatsby. Chapter 7. When curiosity about Gatsby was at its highest, the lights in his house didn't go on one Saturday night, and suddenly, his parties stopped. Cars that turned into his driveway stayed for just a minute and then drove away. Wondering if he were sick, I went over to find out. A new butler with a mean face looked at me suspiciously from the door. Is Mr. Gatsby sick? Nope. After a pause, he added, Sir, grudgingly. I hadn't seen him around and I was worried. Tell him Mr. Caraway came over. Who? He demanded rudely. Caraway. All right, I'll tell him. He slammed the door abruptly. My maid told me that Gatsby had fired all his servants a week ago and replaced them with others who never went into town and ordered supplies over the phone. The grocery boy said the kitchen looked like a pigsty, and people in the village thought the new people weren't servants at all. The next day Gatsby called me on the phone. Going away? I asked. No, old sport. I hear you fired all your servants. I wanted people who wouldn't gossip. Daisy comes over quite often, in the afternoons. So he fired everyone because of her. Their people Wolfsheim wanted to help. They're all brothers and sisters. They used to run a small hotel. I see. He called at Daisy's request. Would I come to lunch at her house tomorrow? Miss Baker would be there too. Half an hour later, Daisy herself called and seemed relieved that I was coming. Something was up, yet I couldn't believe they would choose this occasion for a scene, especially not the one Gatsby had outlined in the garden. The next day was extremely hot, almost the last and certainly the warmest of the summer. As my train emerged from the tunnel into sunlight, only the hot whistles of the National Biscuit Company broke the hush at noon. The straw seats of the car were almost burning. The woman next to me perspired delicately in her white shirtwaist and then, as her newspaper dampened, lapsed despairingly into the heat with a cry. Her pocketbook fell to the floor. Oh my, she gasped. I picked it up and handed it back to her. Hot, said the conductor to familiar faces. Some weather. Hot. Is it hot enough for you? Is it hot? Is it? My ticket came back to me with a dark stain from his hand. No one cared in this heat whose lips he kissed or whose head made damp the pocket over his heart. Through the hall of the Buchanan's house blew a faint wind, carrying the sound of the phone out to Gatsby and me as we waited at the door. The master's body? Roared the butler into the phone. I'm sorry, madam, but we can't touch it this noon. What he really said was, Yes, I'll see. He set down the receiver and came toward us, glistening slightly, to take our hats. Madam expects you in the salon, he cried, indicating the direction. In this heat, every gesture was an effort. The room was dark and cool. Daisy and Jordan lay on an enormous couch like silver idols, weighing down their white dresses against the singing breeze of the fans. We can't move, they said together. Jordan's fingers, powdered white over their tan, rested for a moment in mine. And Mr. Thomas Buchanan the athlete? I asked. Simultaneously, I heard his gruff voice at the hall phone. Gatsby stood in the center of the carpet and gazed around with fascinated eyes. Daisy watched him and laughed her sweet, exciting laugh. A tiny gust of powder rose from her bosom into the air. The rumor is, whispered Jordan, that's Tom's girl on the phone. We were silent. The voice in the hall rose high with annoyance. Very well then, I won't sell you the car at all. I'm under no obligations to you at all, and as for your bothering me about it at lunchtime, I won't stand it. Holding down the receiver, said Daisy cynically. No, he's not, I assured her. It's a bona fide deal. I happen to know about it. Tom flung open the door and hurried into the room. Mr. Gatsby. He put out his hand. I'm glad to see you, sir. Nick. Make us a cold drink, cried Daisy. As he left the room, she got up and went over to Gatsby and kissed him on the mouth. You know I love you, she murmured. You forget there's a lady present, said Jordan. Daisy looked around doubtfully. You kiss Nick too. What a low, vulgar girl. I don't care, cried Daisy and began to clog on the fireplace. Then she remembered the heat and sat down guiltily on the couch just as a nurse led a little girl into the room. Blessed precious, she crooned, holding out her arms. Come to your own mother that loves you. The child, released by the nurse, rushed across the room and rooted shyly into her mother's dress. Blessed precious, did mother get powder on your hair? Stand up now and say, how to do. Gatsby and I leaned down and took the small, reluctant hand. He kept looking at the child with surprise. I don't think he had ever believed in its existence before. I got dressed before lunch, said the child, turning eagerly to Daisy. That's because your mother wanted to show you off. Her face bent into the small white neck. You dream, you absolute little dream. Yes, admitted the child calmly. Aunt Jordan's got on a white dress too. How do you like mother's friends? Daisy turned her to face Gatsby. Do you think they're pretty? Where's Daddy? She doesn't look like her father, explained Daisy. She looks like me. She's got my hair and face. Daisy sat back on the couch. The nurse held out her hand. Come, Pammy. Goodbye, sweetheart. With a backward glance, the child held to her nurse's hand and was pulled out the door just as Tom came back with 4 gin rickeys full of ice. Gatsby took up his drink. They certainly look cool, he said tensely. We drank in long, greedy swallows. I read somewhere that the sun's getting hotter every year, said Tom genially. It seems that soon the earth will fall into the sun, or wait, it's the opposite. The sun's getting colder. Come outside, he suggested to Gatsby. I'd like you to see the place. I went with them to the veranda. On the Green Sound, one small sail crawled slowly toward the fresher sea. Gatsby's eyes followed it momentarily. He raised his hand and pointed across the bay. I'm right across from you. So you are. Our eyes lifted over the rosebeds and the hot lawn. Slowly, the white wings of the boat moved against the blue sky. Ahead lay the ocean and the Blessed Isles. There's sport for you, said Tom, nodding. I'd like to be out there for an hour. We had lunch in the dining room, darkened against the heat, and drank cold ale. What'll we do this afternoon? Cried Daisy, and the next 30 years. Don't be morbid, Jordan said. Life starts over when it gets cool in the fall. But it's so hot, insisted Daisy, almost in tears. Let's all go to town. Her voice struggled through the heat. I've heard of making a garage out of a stable, Tom was saying to Gatsby, but I'm the first man to make a stable out of a garage. Who wants to go to town? Demanded Daisy. Gatsby's eyes floated toward her. Ah, she cried, you look so cool. Their eyes met and they stared together alone. With an effort, she glanced down at the table. You always look so cool, she repeated. She had told him that she loved him, and Tom saw. He was astounded. He looked at Gatsby and then back at Daisy as if he had just recognized her. You resemble the man in the ad, she went on innocently. You know the ad? All right, broke in Tom quickly. I'm willing to go to town. Come on, we're all going to town. He got up, his eyes flashing between Gatsby and his wife. No one moved. Come on, his temper cracked a little. If we're going to town, let's start. His hand trembling, he drank the last of his ale. Daisy's voice got us to our feet and out to the gravel drive. Are we just going? She objected. Like this? Aren't we going to let anyone smoke a cigarette first? Everybody smoked all through lunch. Oh, let's have fun, she begged. It's too hot to fuss. He didn't answer. Have it your way, she said. Come on, Jordan. They went upstairs to get ready while we men shuffled the hot pebbles with our feet. A silver moon hovered in the sky. Gatsby started to speak but changed his mind. Tom turned to him expectantly. "Have you got your stables here?" asked Gatsby with effort. "About a quarter of a mile down the road." "Oh." A pause. "I don't see the idea of going to town," broke out Tom. "Women get these notions." "Shall we take anything to drink?" called Daisy from a window. "I'll get some whiskey," answered Tom. He went inside. Gatsby turned to me rigidly. "I can't say anything in his house, old sport." "She's got an indiscreet voice," I remarked. "It's full of—" I hesitated. "Her voice is full of money," he said suddenly. That was it. It was full of money. The charm that rose and fell in it, the jingle of it. High in a white palace, the king's daughter, the golden girl. Tom came out of the house with a bottle wrapped in a towel, followed by Daisy and Jordan wearing small hats and carrying light capes. "Shall we all go in my car?" suggested Gatsby. He felt the hot leather of the seat. "I should have left it in the shade." "Is it standard shift?" demanded Tom. "Yes." "Well, you take my coupe, and I'll drive your car to town." Gatsby didn't like the idea. "I don't think there's much gas," he objected. "Plenty of gas," said Tom. He looked at the gauge. "And if it runs out, I'll stop at a drugstore." "You can buy anything at a drugstore." A pause followed this remark. Daisy looked at Tom frowning, and an expression that I had only heard described passed over Gatsby's face. "Come on, Daisy," said Tom, pushing her toward Gatsby's car. "I'll take you in this circus wagon." He opened the door, but she moved away. "You take Nick and Jordan. We'll follow in the coupe." She walked close to Gatsby, touching his coat. Jordan, Tom, and I got into Gatsby's car. Tom pushed the gears, and we shot off into the oppressive heat, leaving them behind. "Did you see that?" demanded Tom. "See what?" He looked at me keenly. "You think I'm dumb, don't you?" he suggested. "Maybe I am, but sometimes I know what to do." "Maybe you don't believe that, but science." He paused. The immediate situation pulled him back. "I've investigated this fellow," he continued. "I could have gone deeper if I'd known." "Do you mean you've been to a medium?" inquired Jordan humorously. "What?" He stared as we laughed. "A medium? About Gatsby." "About Gatsby? No, I've investigated his past." "And you found he was an Oxford man," said Jordan helpfully. "An Oxford man?" He was incredulous. "Like hell he is. He wears a pink suit." "Nevertheless, he's an Oxford man." "Oxford, New Mexico," snorted Tom contemptuously. "Listen, Tom, if you're such a snob, why did you invite him to lunch?" demanded Jordan crossly. "Daisy invited him. She knew him before we were married, God knows where." We were all irritable now. As Dr. T.J. Eckelberg's faded eyes came into sight down the road, I remembered Gatsby's caution about gasoline. "We've got enough to get to town," said Tom. "But there's a garage right here," objected Jordan. "I don't want to get stuck in this heat." Tom threw on both brakes impatiently, and we slid to a stop under Wilson's sign. After a moment, the proprietor emerged and gazed hollow-eyed at the car. "Let's have some gas," cried Tom roughly. "What do you think we stopped for?" "I'm sick," said Wilson without moving. "Been sick all day. What's the matter?" "I'm all run down." "Well, shall I help myself?" Tom demanded. "You sounded well enough on the phone." With effort, Wilson left the doorway and unscrewed the tank cap. In the sunlight, his face was green. "I didn't mean to interrupt your lunch," he said. "But I need money and was wondering about your old car." "How do you like this one?" asked Tom. "I bought it last week." "It's a nice yellow one," said Wilson, straining at the handle. "Like to buy it?" "No, but I could make some money on the other." "What do you want money for?" "I've been here too long. I want to get away. My wife and I want to go west." "Your wife does?" exclaimed Tom, startled. "She's been talking about it for 10 years. He rested against the pump. And now she's going whether she wants to or not. I'm going to get her away. The coupe flashed by us with a flurry of dust and a waving hand. What do I owe you? Demanded Tom. I just learned something funny the last 2 days, remarked Wilson. That's why I want to get away. That's why I've been bothering you about the car. What do I owe you? $1.20. The relentless heat was beginning to confuse me. I stared at Wilson and then at Tom. Wilson was so sick that he looked guilty. I'll let you have that car, said Tom. I'll send it over tomorrow afternoon. That area was always disquieting. I turned my head as though warned of something behind. Over the ash heaps, the giant eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg kept their vigil. Other eyes were regarding us from less than 20 feet away. In one of the windows over the garage, Myrtle Wilson was peering down at the car. She had no consciousness of being observed. One emotion after another crept into her face like objects into a picture. Her eyes, wide with jealous terror, were fixed not on Tom but on Jordan Baker, whom she took to be his wife. There is no confusion like the confusion of a simple mind. Tom was feeling panic. His wife and his mistress were slipping from his control. He stepped on the accelerator with the double purpose of overtaking Daisy and leaving Wilson behind. We sped toward Astoria at 50 miles an hour until we came in sight of the blue coupe. Those big movies around 50th Street are cool, suggested Jordan. I love New York on summer afternoons when everyone's away. There's something very sensuous about it, like overripe fruit. The word, sensuous, disquieted Tom, but before he could protest, the coupe stopped, and Daisy signaled us to draw up alongside. Where are we going? She cried. How about the movies? It's so hot, she complained. You go. We'll ride around and meet you after. With an effort, her wit rose faintly. We'll meet you on some corner. I'll be the man smoking 2 cigarettes. We can't argue about it here, Tom said impatiently. You follow me to the south side of Central Park in front of the plaza. Several times he turned his head to look back. If the traffic delayed them, he slowed until they came into sight. I think he was afraid they would dart down a side street and out of his life forever. But they didn't, and we all took the step of engaging the parlor of a suite in the Plaza Hotel. The prolonged argument that ended by herding us into that room eludes me. I remember my underwear climbing like a damp snake around my legs and beads of sweat racing across my back. The idea began with Daisy's suggestion that we hire 5 bathrooms and take cold baths, and then assumed more form as a place to have a mint julep. Each of us said over and over that it was a crazy idea. We all talked at once to a baffled clerk and thought we were being very funny. The room was large and stifling. Opening the windows admitted only a gust of hot shrubbery from the park. Daisy went to the mirror and stood with her back to us fixing her hair. It's a swell suite, whispered Jordan, and everyone laughed. Open another window, commanded Daisy without turning around. There aren't any more. Well, we'd better call for an axe. The thing to do is forget about the heat, said Tom impatiently. You make it 10 times worse by complaining about it. He unwrapped the bottle of whiskey and put it on the table. Why not let her alone, old sport, remarked Gatsby. You're the one that wanted to come to town. There was a moment of silence. The phone book fell from its nail and hit the floor, whereupon Jordan whispered, "Excuse me," but this time no one laughed. "I'll pick it up," I offered. "I've got it." Gatsby examined the parted string, muttered, in an interested way, and tossed the book on a chair. "That's a great expression of yours, isn't it?" said Tom sharply. "What is all this old sport business? Where'd you pick that up?" "Now see here, Tom," said Daisy, turning around from the mirror, "if you're going to make personal remarks, I won't stay here a minute. Call up and order some ice for the mint julep." As Tom picked up the receiver, the heat exploded into sound, and we were listening to Mendelssohn's Wedding March from the ballroom below. Imagine marrying anybody in this heat, cried Jordan dismally. Still, I was married in the middle of June, Daisy remembered. Louisville in June, somebody fainted. Who was it, Tom? Biloxi, he answered shortly. A man named Biloxi. Blocks, Biloxi, and he made boxes, and he was from Biloxi, Tennessee. They carried him into my house, added Jordan, because we lived just 2 doors from the church. And he stayed 3 weeks until Daddy told him he had to get out. The day after he left, Daddy died. After a moment she added, there wasn't any connection. I used to know a Bill Biloxi from Memphis, I remarked. That was his cousin. I knew his whole family history before he left. He gave me an aluminum putter that I use today. The music had died down as the ceremony began, and now a cheer floated in at the window followed by cries of, yay, aya, aya, and finally by a burst of jazz as the dancing began. We're getting old, said Daisy. If we were young, we'd rise and dance. Remember Biloxi, Jordan warned her. Where'd you know him, Tom? Biloxi? He concentrated. I didn't know him. He was a friend of Daisy's. He was not, she denied. I'd never seen him before. He came down in the private car. Well, he said he knew you. He said he was raised in Louisville. Asa Bird brought him around at the last minute and asked if we had room for him. Jordan smiled. He was probably bumming his way home. He told me he was president of your class at Yale. Tom and I looked at each other blankly. Biloxi? First place, we didn't have any president. Gatsby's foot tapped restlessly and Tom eyed him suddenly. By the way, Mr. Gatsby, I understand you're an Oxford man. Not exactly. Oh yes, I understand you went to Oxford. Yes, I went there. A pause. Then Tom's voice, incredulous and insulting. You must have gone there about the time Biloxi went to New Haven. Another pause. A waiter knocked and came in with crushed mint and ice, but the silence was unbroken by his thank you, and the soft closing of the door. This detail was to be cleared up at last. I told you I went there, said Gatsby. I heard you, but I'd like to know when. It was in 1919. I only stayed 5 months. That's why I can't call myself an Oxford man. Tom glanced around to see if we mirrored his disbelief. But we were all looking at Gatsby. It was an opportunity they gave to some officers after the war, he continued. We could go to any university in England or France. I wanted to slap him on the back. I had a renewal of complete faith in him. Daisy rose, smiling faintly, and went to the table. Open the whiskey, Tom, she ordered, and I'll make you a mint julep. Then you won't seem so stupid to yourself. Look at the mint. Wait a minute, snapped Tom. I want to ask Mr. Gatsby one more question. Go on, Gatsby said politely. What kind of a row are you trying to cause in my house? They were out in the open, and Gatsby was content. He isn't causing a row. Daisy looked desperately from one to the other. You're causing a row. Please have a little self-control. Self-control, repeated Tom incredulously. I suppose the latest thing is to sit back and let Mr. Nobody from Nowhere make love to your wife. Well, if that's the idea, you can count me out. Nowadays, people begin by sneering at family life and family institutions, and next they'll throw everything overboard and have intermarriage between black and white. Flushed with his words, he saw himself standing alone on the last barrier of civilization. We're all white here, murmured Jordan. I know I'm not very popular. I don't give big parties. I suppose you've got to make your house into a pigsty to have any friends, in the modern world. Angry as I was tempted to laugh whenever he opened his mouth. The change from libertine to prig was complete. I've got something to tell you, old sport, began Gatsby. But Daisy guessed his intention. Please don't, she interrupted. Please let's all go home. Why don't we all go home? That's a good idea, I got up. Come on, Tom, nobody wants a drink. I want to know what Mr. Gatsby has to tell me. Your wife doesn't love you, said Gatsby. She's never loved you. She loves me. You must be crazy, exclaimed Tom automatically. Gatsby sprang to his feet, excited. She never loved you, do you hear? He cried. She only married you because I was poor and she was tired of waiting for me. It was a mistake, but in her heart she never loved anyone except me. Jordan and I tried to go, but Tom and Gatsby insisted we stay, as though neither of them had anything to hide and it would be a privilege to share their emotions. Sit down, Daisy, Tom's voice tried to be fatherly. What's been going on? I want to hear all about it. I told you what's been going on, said Gatsby. Going on for 5 years, and you didn't know. Tom turned to Daisy sharply. You've been seeing this fellow for 5 years? Not seeing, said Gatsby. No, we couldn't meet. But both of us loved each other all that time, old sport, and you didn't know. I used to laugh sometimes, but there was no laughter in his eyes. To think that you didn't know. Oh, that's all. Tom tapped his fingers together like a clergyman and leaned back in his chair. You're crazy, he exploded. I can't speak about what happened 5 years ago because I didn't know Daisy then, and I'll be damned if I see how you got near her unless you brought the groceries to the back door. But all the rest of that's a lie. Daisy loved me when she married me and she loves me now. No, said Gatsby, shaking his head. She does. The trouble is that sometimes she gets foolish ideas in her head and doesn't know what she's doing. He nodded. And what's more, I love Daisy too. Once in a while I go off and make a fool of myself, but I always come back and in my heart I love her all the time. You're revolting, said Daisy. She turned to me. Do you know why we left Chicago? I'm surprised they didn't tell you the story of that little spree. Gatsby stood beside her. Daisy, that's all over now, he said earnestly. It doesn't matter anymore. Just tell him the truth. That you never loved him, and it's all wiped out. She looked at him blindly. Why? How could I love him? Possibly. You never loved him. She hesitated. Her eyes fell on Jordan and me with a sort of appeal, as though she realized what she was doing. But it was done now. It was too late. I never loved him, she said with reluctance. Not at Kapiolani? Demanded Tom suddenly. No. From the ballroom beneath, muffled chords were drifting up on hot waves of air. Not that day I carried you down from the punch bowl to keep your shoes dry? There was tenderness in his tone. Daisy, please don't. Her voice was cold, but the anger was gone. She looked at Gatsby. There, Jay, she said, but her hand, as she tried to light a cigarette, was trembling. Suddenly she threw the cigarette and the match on the carpet. Oh, you want too much, she cried to Gatsby. I love you now, isn't that enough? I can't help what's past. She began to sob helplessly. I did love him once, but I loved you too. Gatsby's eyes opened and closed. You loved me too? He repeated. Even that's a lie, said Tom savagely. She didn't know you were alive. Why? There's things between Daisy and me that you'll never know, things that neither of us can forget. The words seemed to hurt Gatsby. I want to speak to Daisy alone, he insisted. She's all excited now. Even alone I can't say I never loved Tom, she admitted. It wouldn't be true. Of course it wouldn't, agreed Tom. She turned to her husband. As if it mattered to you, she said. Of course it matters. I'm going to take better care of you from now on. You don't understand, said Gatsby. You're not going to take care of her anymore. I'm not? Tom opened his eyes and laughed. Why's that? Daisy's leaving you. Nonsense. I am though, she said with effort. She's not leaving me. Tom's words leaned down over Gatsby. Certainly not for a common swindler who'd have to steal the ring he put on her finger. I won't stand this, cried Daisy. Oh, please let's get out. "Who are you anyhow?" broke out Tom. "You're one of that bunch that hangs around with Meyer Wolfsheim. That much I know. I've made a little investigation into your affairs, and I'll go further tomorrow." "You can suit yourself about that, old sport," said Gatsby steadily. "I found out what your drugstores were." He turned to us. He and Wolfsheim bought up side street drugstores and sold grain alcohol over the counter. That's one of his stunts. I picked him for a bootlegger the first time I saw him, and I wasn't far wrong. "What about it?" said Gatsby politely. "I guess your friend Walter Chase wasn't too proud to come in on it. And you left him in the lurch, didn't you? You let him go to jail for a month over in New Jersey. God, you should hear Walter on the subject of you. He came to us dead broke. He was glad to pick up some money, old sport." "Don't call me old sport," cried Tom. Gatsby said nothing. Walter could have you up on the betting laws too, but Wolfsheim scared him into shutting his mouth. That familiar yet strange look was back on Gatsby's face. "That drugstore business was small change," continued Tom, "but you've got something now that Walter's afraid to tell me about." I glanced at Daisy, who was staring terrified between Gatsby and her husband, and at Jordan, who had begun to balance an invisible object on the tip of her chin. Then I turned back to Gatsby, and was startled at his expression. He looked as if he had killed a man. For a moment, his face could be described that way. It passed, and he began to talk to Daisy, denying everything, defending his name against accusations that had not been made. But with every word, she was drawing further into herself. The dead dream fought on as the afternoon slipped away, trying to touch what was no longer tangible, struggling toward that lost voice across the room. The voice begged again to go. "Please, Tom, I can't stand this anymore." Her frightened eyes told that whatever intentions she had were gone. "You two start on home, Daisy," said Tom. "In Mr. Gatsby's car." She looked at Tom, alarmed, but he insisted. "Go on. He won't annoy you. I think he realizes that his flirtation is over." They were gone without a word, accidental and isolated like ghosts, even from our pity. After a moment, Tom got up and began wrapping the unopened bottle of whiskey in the towel. "Want any of this stuff? Jordan? Nick?" I didn't answer. "Nick?" he asked again. "What? Want any?" "No, I just remembered that today's my birthday. I was 30. Before me stretched a new decade. It was 7 o'clock when we got into the coupe and started for Long Island." Tom talked incessantly, exulting and laughing, but his voice was remote from Jordan and me. Human sympathy has its limits, and we were content to let their arguments fade with the city lights behind. 30. The promise of a decade of loneliness, a thinning list of single men to know, a thinning briefcase of enthusiasm, thinning hair. But there was Jordan beside me, too wise to carry forgotten dreams from age to age. As we passed over the dark bridge, her wan face fell against my shoulder, and the formidable stroke of 30 died away with her hand's reassuring pressure. We drove on toward death through the cooling twilight. The young Greek Michaelis, who ran the coffee joint beside the ash heaps, was the principal witness at the inquest. He had slept through the heat until after 5 when he strolled over to the garage and found George Wilson sick in his office, really sick, pale and shaking. Michaelis advised him to go to bed, but Wilson refused, saying he'd miss a lot of business. While his neighbor tried to persuade him, a racket broke out overhead. "I've got my wife locked in up there," explained Wilson. "She's staying there till the day after tomorrow, and then we're moving away." Michaelis was astonished. They had been neighbors for 4 years, and Wilson had never seemed capable of such a statement. Generally, he was a worn-out man. When he wasn't working, he sat in the doorway and stared at the people and cars that passed. When anyone spoke to him, he laughed in an agreeable way. He was his wife's man and not his own. So Michaelis tried to find out what had happened, but Wilson wouldn't say a word. Instead, he began to throw suspicious glances at his visitor and ask him what he'd been doing at certain times on certain days. Just as Michaelis was getting uneasy, some workmen passed the door, and he took the opportunity to get away. But he didn't come back. He supposed he forgot. When he came out again, a little after 7, he was reminded of the conversation because he heard Mrs. Wilson's voice loud and scolding downstairs. "Beat me," he heard her cry. "Throw me down and beat me, you coward." A moment later, she rushed out into the dusk waving her hands and shouting. Before he could move, it was over. The death car didn't stop. It came out of the darkness, wavered for a moment, and then disappeared around the bend. Michaelis wasn't even sure of its color. He told the first policeman that it was light green. The other car, going toward New York, came to rest 100 yards beyond, and its driver hurried back to where Myrtle Wilson, her life violently ended, knelt in the road and mingled her dark blood with the dust. Michaelis and this man reached her first, but when they had torn open her shirtwaist still damp with sweat, they saw that her left breast was swinging loose like a flap and there was no need to listen for the heart beneath. The mouth was wide open and ripped a little at the corners as though she had choked a little in giving up the tremendous vitality she had stored so long. We saw the cars and the crowd when we were still some distance away. "Wreck," said Tom. "That's good. Wilson will have a little business at last." He slowed down but still without any intention of stopping until, as we came nearer, the faces of the people at the garage door made him put on the brakes. "We'll take a look," he said doubtfully, "just a look." I became aware of a wailing sound from the garage, a sound which resolved into the words, "Oh my God," uttered over and over in a gasping moan. "There's trouble here," said Tom excitedly. He peered over a circle of heads into the garage. Then he made a harsh sound in his throat and with a movement of his arms pushed his way through. The circle closed up again. It was a minute before I could see anything at all. Then new arrivals deranged the line, and Jordan and I were pushed inside. Myrtle Wilson's body, wrapped in a blanket, lay on a work table by the wall, and Tom, with his back to us, was bending over it motionless. Next to him stood a policeman taking down names. At first, I couldn't find the source of the high groaning words that echoed through the garage. Then I saw Wilson standing on the threshold of his office, swaying and holding to the doorposts with both hands. Some man was talking to him in a low voice and attempting to lay a hand on his shoulder, but Wilson neither heard nor saw. His eyes would drop slowly from the swinging light to the table by the wall and then jerk back to the light again, and he gave out his high, horrible call. "Oh my God, oh my God, oh God, oh my God." Presently Tom lifted his head with a jerk and after staring around the garage with glazed eyes addressed a remark to the policeman. "Mav," the policeman was saying. "Oh. No R," corrected the man. "Mavro." "Listen to me," muttered Tom fiercely. "R," said the policeman. "Oh. G. G." He looked up as Tom's hand fell on his shoulder. "What you want, fella? What happened? That's what I want to know." "Otto hit her. Instantly killed. Instantly killed," repeated Tom staring. "She ran out in the road. The car didn't even stop." "There were 2 cars," said Michaelis, "one coming, one going." "Going where?" asked the policeman keenly. "One going each way." "Well, his hand rose toward the blankets but stopped halfway and fell to his side. "She ran out there and the one coming from New York hit her going 30 or 40 miles an hour." "What's the name of this place here?" demanded the officer. "Hasn't got any name." A well-dressed man stepped near. "It was a yellow car," he said, "big yellow car." "New. See the accident?" asked the policeman. "No, But the car passed me down the road going faster than 40. Going 50, 60. Come here and let's have your name. Look out now. I want to get his name. Some words of this conversation must have reached Wilson, for suddenly a new theme found voice among his cries. You don't have to tell me what kind of car it was. I know what kind of car it was. Watching Tom, I saw the muscle back of his shoulder tighten under his coat. He walked quickly over to Wilson and seized him firmly by the arms. You've got to pull yourself together, he said. Wilson's eyes fell upon Tom. He started up on his tiptoes and then would have collapsed had Tom not held him upright. Listen, said Tom, shaking him. I just got here from New York. I was bringing you that coupe we've been talking about. That yellow car I was driving this afternoon wasn't mine, do you hear? I haven't seen it all afternoon. Only the man and I were near enough to hear, but the policeman caught something and looked over with eyes. What's all that? He demanded. I'm a friend of his. Tom turned his head but kept his hands firm on Wilson's body. He says he knows the car that did it. It was a yellow car. Some impulse moved the policeman to look suspiciously at Tom. And what color's your car? It's a blue car, a coupe. We've come straight from New York, I said. Someone who had been driving behind us confirmed this and the policeman turned away. Now if you'll let me have that name again correct. Picking up Wilson like a doll, Tom carried him into the office, set him down in a chair, and came back. If somebody'll come here and sit with him, he snapped. He watched while the two men standing closest glanced at each other and went into the room. Then Tom shut the door on them and came down the step, avoiding the table. As he passed close to me, he whispered, "Let's get out." With his arms breaking the way, we pushed through the crowd, passing a hurried doctor who had been sent for in wild hope. Tom drove slowly until we were beyond the bend. Then his foot came down hard and the coupe raced along through the night. In a little while, I heard a low sob and saw that tears were flowing down his face. The coward, he whimpered. He didn't even stop his car. The Buchanan's house floated toward us through the dark trees. Tom stopped beside the porch and looked up at the second floor where two windows glowed with light. Daisy's home, he said. As we got out of the car, he glanced at me and frowned slightly. I ought to have dropped you in West Egg, Nick. There's nothing we can do tonight. A change had come over him, and he spoke gravely. As we walked across the moonlight gravel to the porch, he disposed of the situation in a few phrases. I'll call a taxi to take you home, and while you're waiting, you and Jordan better go in the kitchen and have them get you some supper, if you want any. He opened the door. Come in. No thanks, but I'd be glad if you'd order me the taxi. I'll wait outside. Jordan put her hand on my arm. Won't you come in, Nick? No thanks. I was feeling a little sick and I wanted to be alone. But Jordan lingered for a moment more. It's only 9:30, she said. I'd be damned if I'd go in. I'd had enough of all of them for one day, and suddenly that included Jordan too. She must have seen something in my expression, for she turned abruptly away and ran up the porch steps into the house. I sat down for a few minutes with my head in my hands until I heard the phone taken up inside and the butler calling a taxi. Then I walked slowly down the drive away from the house, intending to wait by the gate. I hadn't gone 20 yards when I heard my name, and Gatsby stepped from between two bushes into the path. I must have felt weird by that time because I could think of nothing except the luminosity of his pink suit under the moon. What are you doing? I inquired. Just standing here, old sport. Somehow that seemed despicable. For all I knew he was going to rob the house in a moment. I wouldn't have been surprised to see faces behind him in the dark. Did you see any trouble on the road? He asked after a minute. Yes. He hesitated. Was she killed? Yes. I thought so. I told Daisy I thought so. It's better that the shock should all come at once. She stood it well. He spoke as if Daisy's reaction was the only thing that mattered. I got to West Egg by a side road, he went on, and left the car in my garage. I don't think anybody saw us, but I can't be sure. I disliked him so much by this time that I didn't find it necessary to tell him he was wrong. Who was the woman? He inquired. Her name was Wilson. Her husband owns the garage. How did it happen? Well, I tried to swing the wheel. He broke off and I guessed the truth. Was Daisy driving? Yes, he said after a moment, but I'll say I was. You see, when we left New York, she was very nervous and thought it would steady her to drive, and this woman rushed out at us just as we were passing a car coming the other way. It all happened in a minute, but it seemed to me that she wanted to speak to us, thought we were somebody she knew. Well, first Daisy turned away from the woman toward the other car, and then she lost her nerve and turned back. The second my hand reached the wheel I felt the shock. It must have killed her instantly. It ripped her open. Don't tell me, old sport. He winced. Anyhow, Daisy stepped on it. I tried to make her stop, but she couldn't, so I pulled on the brake. Then she fell into my lap and I drove on. She'll be all right tomorrow, he said. I'm just going to wait here and see if he bothers her about that unpleasantness. She's locked herself in her room, and if he tries any brutality, she's going to turn the light out and on again. He won't touch her, I said. He's not thinking about her. I don't trust him, old sport. How long are you going to wait? All night if necessary. Anyhow, till they all go to bed. A new point of view occurred to me. Suppose Tom found out that Daisy had been driving. He might think he saw a connection in it. He might think anything. I looked at the house. There were a few bright windows downstairs and the pink glow from Daisy's room on the ground floor. You wait here, I said. I'll see if there's any sign of a commotion. I walked back along the border of the lawn, traversed the gravel softly, and tiptoed up the veranda steps. The drawing room curtains were open and the room was empty. Crossing the porch where we had dined that June night 3 months before, I came to a small rectangle of light which I guessed was the pantry window. The blind was drawn, but I found a rift at the sill. Daisy and Tom were sitting opposite each other at the kitchen table with a plate of cold fried chicken between them and 2 bottles of ale. He was talking across the table at her, and in his earnestness, his hand had fallen upon and covered her own. Once in a while, she looked up at him and nodded. They weren't happy, and neither of them had touched the chicken or the ale, and yet they weren't unhappy either. There was an unmistakable air of intimacy about the picture, and anybody would have said that they were conspiring together. As I tiptoed from the porch, I heard my taxi feeling its way along the dark road toward the house. Gatsby was waiting where I had left him in the drive. Is it all quiet up there? He asked anxiously. Yes, it's all quiet. I hesitated. You'd better come home and get some sleep. He shook his head. I want to wait here till Daisy goes to bed. Good night, old sport. He put his hands in his coat pockets and turned back to his scrutiny of the house as though my presence marred the sacredness of the vigil. So I walked away and left him standing there in the moonlight, watching over nothing.